Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in Canada as he continues his effort to rally Western nations' support for Kyiv's efforts to repel Russia's invasion. Zelensky and his wife were greeted at the airport by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The unannounced trip is Zelensky's first to Canada since Russia invaded Ukraine. He is expected to address Parliament in Ottawa later today. He last addressed the Canadian Parliament virtually shortly after the war started in March of 2022. Now, Zelensky's visit comes after he met with U.S. President Joe Biden and lawmakers in Washington earlier on Thursday. That meeting led to Biden announcing $325 million in new military aid for Ukraine.
President Volodymyr Zelensky did not have to wait long before he secured more U.S. funding to repel Russia's attacks in Ukraine. Soon after he set foot in the White House, U.S. President Joe Biden announced a new military aid package and the delivery next week of the first Abrams tanks. Ukraine has been pushing hard for the M1 Abrams since Washington promised them to Kyiv in January.
I thank the United States of America and Mr. President for the new defense package for Ukraine, a very powerful package. Thank you so much. And it has exactly what our soldiers need now.
Earlier, Zelensky laid a wreath at the 9/11 memorial at the Pentagon and met U.S. lawmakers at the Capitol. His visit comes at a time of growing divisions in Congress over future funding for Ukraine, with many Republicans arguing the money would be better spent at home. But the Biden administration is pledging unwavering support for Kyiv in its fight against Russia.
We're committed to help Ukraine build a force capable of ensuring Ukraine's long-term security, capable of deterring future threats against sovereignty, territorial integrity, and freedom, which are underway now. Because that's what this is all about, the future of freedom. America can never, will never walk away from that.
The new U.S. package is a welcome boost for Ukraine's forces and air defense capability as they battle Russian troops in a slow-moving counteroffensive.
Let's get more on this. We have team coverage. CW's Aya Ibrahim is in Washington, D.C., and Nick Connolly joins us with the view from Kyiv. Nick, I'd like to begin with you. So we just heard there, Ukraine getting another package of military aid from the United States. But Zelensky didn't get everything that he wanted, did he?
Exactly, Sarah. He didn't get those ATACMS longer-range missiles that had been hoped for, that with the 300-kilometer range could really allow Ukraine to start attacking Russian logistics, especially in Crimea and across occupied Ukraine. That is something that has been on the top of Ukraine's wish list for months, if not years. There is still hope that it might happen next time around, but I think this was more about the longer-term lobbying, about trying to shore up that cross-party support for Ukraine in Washington, and also about the future spending package. $24 billion for Ukraine spending being talked of, and there's a real sense that the Ukrainians wanted to remind people in Washington what that would be used for and that would be used transparently. And there were a lot of thank yous. I think that charge that Ukraine has been ungrateful and has kind of not recognized the support, the unprecedented support it's received, that has really stung. So there were lots of attempts to say thank you, not only to lawmakers, but also to the American people more widely. And there is a sense that, yes, things aren't as easy and as clear-cut as maybe they were last time around that Zelensky was in Washington, but still this was largely a successful visit.
And Aya, Zelensky also meeting with U.S. lawmakers. How much bipartisan support is there among lawmakers for sending more military assistance to Ukraine?
Well, we have to say that Ukraine and President Zelensky still enjoys great support across the aisle, including from very prominent Republicans, such as Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader. The key word here when it comes to growing resistance to Ukraine funding is House Republicans. I mean, Zelensky made this visit at a difficult time for Ukraine, right in the middle of the counteroffensive, but also this is a politically fraught time here in Washington. The United States House of Representatives is currently debating a budget that includes, as Nick mentioned, an extra $24 billion in funding for Ukraine. And there is a minority in the Republican-controlled House that is vehemently opposed to giving Ukraine any more money. And their leader and the leader of the House, Speaker McCarthy, is also in a politically difficult situation. He's facing a growing rebellion among his ranks, and he's trying as much as possible not to provoke them further so that he doesn't get ousted. And Ukraine is definitely a sticking issue there, and that package will be voted on September 30th, and it remains to be seen if Zelensky was able to make an argument convincing enough to these House Republicans. That money, the new aid package that was announced by the White House, $325 million, I believe, that's all utilizing existing funding, and so new funding is a key topic.
To what extent, Aya, is that sentiment that we are hearing from those House Republicans playing to some public opinion out there? How steadfast is the support for Ukraine among the public?
It's waning. We're 19 months into the conflict, and there is a sense of fatigue among the American population. A recent poll showed that 55%, so a majority of Americans, are actually opposed to Congress authorizing any more funding for Ukraine. We are ahead of an election year where Republicans are already using the Ukraine issue to stoke up support, opposing more funding for Ukraine. We're seeing that. We saw this in the Republican primaries already. And we're also in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So it seems that for the average American, whenever they hear about Ukraine, they hear about the battlefield, which often they hear is not going very well, or they're hearing about how much money their government is giving to Ukraine.
Okay. Nick, Zelensky is now in Canada. What does he hope to achieve there?
Well, I think Canada, unlike the US, doesn't have lots of weapons in stock that it can just send this way. It has financially supported lots of weapons purchases for Ukraine, but I think this is again about gratitude and about kind of expressing that gratitude and shoring up, especially links with the big Ukrainian diaspora in Canada that is also politically influential there. And it is about showing that Ukraine is listening and also willing to be transparent and talk about and explain how this money is being spent, not just in the US. Those questions about how that money is being spent, about corruption in the Ukrainian government, that is increasingly problematic for them. So they're really trying to show that they're listening to that criticism and kind of offering answers.
Well, Zelensky did not get all the weapons that he was hoping to get from President Biden. Our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv told us more.
He didn't get the ATACMS long-range missiles that Ukraine's been asking for months now. He also didn't get to address Congress as he had requested to. But I think the expectations here in Kyiv weren't actually that high. This was never going to be as easy as last year. Last time Zelensky was in D.C., that was in December of last year. It was just after Ukraine had taken back swathes of territories from the Russians, unexpectedly, at least if you go by the expectations of lots of Western capitals. So he was riding a wave of success then. The successes on the front lines this year have proven slower and more difficult, so there's less kind of momentum there. But I think this was about lobbying behind closed doors, asking for money. This most recent package was comparatively modest. It was a routine transfer of supplies, but they're pushing for a further $24 billion worth of military aid over the next financial year. So I think that was crucial in all of this. I think there's an understanding here in Ukraine that as the elections draw closer in America, this is going to become more divisive, and that bipartisan support might be a little less firm. Today now, Canada, he's there to say thank you all the time. Canada's a country with a huge Ukrainian diaspora, also supported Ukraine significantly during this war, obviously has less in the way of military supplies to hand over. But I think that charge that Ukraine has been ungrateful for Western support, that really stings, and that's something they're trying to work against now.
That was DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Now, let's take a look at the bigger picture regarding Ukraine with Ben Hodges. He's the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe and now serves as a senior advisor to Human Rights First. Thanks for being with us, General. Good to see you. Now, Kyiv is not getting the long-range missile systems Zelensky says his troops so desperately need. Poland, one of Ukraine's biggest backers, says it will not make any new weapons pledges to Kyiv. Are Ukraine's allies dropping the ball?
I think that the 54 nations that are supporting Ukraine will continue to support Ukraine, including Poland. But I do think that our president has stopped short of doing what he needs to do which is to say that he wants Ukraine to win. If he says he wants Ukraine to win, then there's no more excuses about availability of ATACMS or how long it takes to do certain things. We get serious and deliver these capabilities that are needed. And the president also has to speak to the American people as if they were adults and explain why this is in our interest. And then I think you'd see that support in Congress would remain very strong.
What do you make of the spat we're seeing right now between Kyiv and Warsaw? Poland is blocking Ukraine's grain exports, and Kyiv is challenging Poland on that. Is Volodymyr Zelensky overplaying his hand in this dispute?
I think that, Terry, what we're seeing is Polish domestic politics. They have a huge election coming up here in the middle of October, on the 15th of October. And so I think this is more about that than anything else. Poland has done so much to help Ukraine. Ukraine knows that. So I think this will probably be resolved appropriately between ministers and heads of government. And after the election, I think we'll be back to a much more appropriate sort of relationship.
General Hodges, you know that the U.S. its support for Ukraine is absolutely essential. The Republicans in U.S. Congress are threatening to block further aid for Ukraine. Is there anyone who can fill the gap if President Biden can no longer deliver what Ukraine needs?
So just to be specific, it's a handful of Republicans that have outsized amount of influence because Speaker McCarthy owes his position as Speaker to this small handful of right-wing extremists. There are more than 120 Republicans who have just signed a letter saying that they support continued aid for Ukraine. So you're talking now with that plus all the Democrats, 3/4 of the Congress still supports Ukraine. But the president cannot assume that this will stay forever. He has his own big election coming up November next year, and so do all 435 members of the House and 1/3 of the Senate, as you know. So the president has to make the case to the American people about why this is to our best interest that Ukraine is successful, that Europe remains stable and secure. That affects American prosperity. If the United States, God forbid, if there is a Trump administration that comes next and American support and involvement in Europe weakens, other countries will have to step up because this is about stability and security in Europe, whether or not the United States is there to help ensure it.
Now, support for Ukraine appears to be waning among some allies. There's a certain amount of fatigue that can be seen. Could this end up forcing Kyiv to accept some sort of negotiated peace deal that it might not like?
Well, that's certainly what Vladimir Putin is hoping for. The Kremlin knows that they have no other options. I mean, they are losing this war. Ukraine has the initiative. Just a few hours ago, missiles were impacting in the Russian Navy base in Sevastopol again. So that's only going to get worse for the Russian side. So their only hope is to drag this out, hope that we get tired, and hope that Donald Trump is reelected as president. That's their only hope. So I think that there will be efforts. You'll hear, I think, pressure on Ukraine to go to some sort of negotiated settlement for the sake of peace. But anybody that has ever opened a history book knows that Russia never lives up to any agreement they ever make. The Ukrainians know they cannot trust any negotiated settlement with Russia, where Russia is left holding Crimea, the decisive terrain of this war. And I think, this phrase fatigue, I've heard it several times from others as well. Not one German soldier, not one American soldier, not one British, French, or Polish soldier is lost, has been killed or injured in this war. Ukrainians are the ones doing the fighting. So fatigue, I think, actually is a poor choice of words for what we're talking about. If our elected officials talk to their populations as adults and explain why this is important, I think most people will continue to support it.
The former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, Ben Hodges, thank you so much.